This is 2000's Unbreakable. Warning, spoilers ahead. We open up at a Philadelphia department store in 1961, and Mr. Matheson is escorted to the back room, where Elijah's mother holds the screaming baby. When Mr. Matheson takes Elijah in his arms, the baby continues to scream out in pain, and his face becomes disturbed when he sees the state of the baby. He asks the woman in the department store if Elijah had been dropped after the labor, but she assures him that everything was quick and easy. Mr. Matheson informs Elijah's mother that the baby actually has broken arms and legs. Next, we meet David Dunn in the present while he rides the train, and the girl in the front row of him is playing games with him. He kindly acknowledges the little girl, but he goes back to looking out his window until Kelly appears. When she finds out that he's sitting alone, she decides to take the seat next to him. David takes off his wedding ring after he admires Kelly's midriff, and he tries to offer her a magazine to read. Once David finds out that Kelly's a sports agent, he immediately tries to pour on the charm with his sports jokes. After he continues to charm her, she tells him that she's married, and things get so awkward that she decides to go find another seat. Once Kelly leaves, David puts his ring back on, and he goes back to looking out the window. Even the little girl knows that he messed up. She's giving him a look as though she's going to hop off the train, find his wife, and tell her everything that she just saw. She's gonna be the host of Cheaters when she grows up. Suddenly, the passengers on the train start to hear a train horn that's growing louder and louder. And we cut to Joseph Dunn as he's flipping through the channels on the TV. Eventually, he comes to a news report that's covering the derailing of David's train, and he goes to make sure that it's the train that his father's supposed to be on. Later, David wakes up in the hospital and he appears to have no injuries. The doctor tells him why he's in the hospital, and he tries to find out the specifics of where David was sitting in the passenger car. David assures him that he was just sitting by the window like a normal passenger, and the doctor's amazed that he doesn't even have a single scratch on him. It turns out that he's the only survivor of the train wreck. I'm sure he's grateful to be alive, but the guilt of being the only survivor would probably eat away at a normal person. Especially when he walks out into the hall and he sees all of the loved ones that are waiting for their family members. Nope, it's just David. Joseph is happy to see him though. Audrey? Not so much. When David gets home, he tries to go about his normal routine, but when Audrey asks what happened on his trip, he tells her that he didn't get the job. He assures her that he's still going to move there, but it's just not going to happen right now. The two of them say goodnight and David goes to bed. A few days later, David goes to the church that's holding a memorial service for the passengers of the train accident. But when he gets back to his car, he finds a letter on his windshield. The letter asks how many days of his life he's been sick, and David immediately starts looking around the parking lot for whoever could have left it. When he goes to work, the question is still bothering him, and he asks the receptionist to look at how many sick days he's taken since he started working there. I wouldn't need to ask that question. My answer's way too many to count. Don't even bother looking. David gets confirmation that he's never taken a sick day in over 5 years, and he heads home for the day. That night, David goes to Audrey's room, and he asks her when the last time he was sick was. She can't think of a day that he's been sick, but she just assumes that he's too tired to remember. Jump over to West Philadelphia in 1974, and we see Elijah has grown up. He's tired of getting hurt though, and the kids at school call him Mr. Glass, since he breaks like a piece of glass. His mother tries to motivate him to go back out there to do something with his life, and she gives him a present. Actually, she doesn't give him a present. She sits it on a bench across the street where a lot of other kids are playing around. This is West Philadelphia. That present would have been gone by the time his mother made it to their doorstep. There's no way no one has snatched that up yet. This is the mother's way of convincing Elijah to get out of the house, and he makes his way to the bench. When he opens the present, he finds a limited edition comic book inside. His mother tells him that there'll be one on the bench every time he comes out of the house, and in present day, Elijah shows off a drawing of the same comic book cover. The man he's talking to agrees to buy it, and he finds out that the buyer is buying a collector's item to give to his 4-year-old son. Elijah doesn't appreciate the sentiment, and he tells the buyer to leave. As the buyer leaves, David arrives, because he recognizes the name of the store from the card he received. Elijah sits down with David and Joseph to go over his checklist of David being a superhero, and he explains that he thinks comic books are actually a way of passing down history that got commercialized. He tells David that he thinks that he might be one of them. Then he goes over his genetic disorder, and it's actually a real thing. Osteogenesis imperfecta is a genetic disease that causes someone to have extremely brittle bones. This explains him being born with broken limbs and his childhood name, Mr. Glass. After hearing Elijah's theory, David thinks that he's trying to scam him, and he leaves with Joseph. That night, David checks on the gun in his closet, and he goes through a folder that has old football clippings of his college days as a star. Eventually, he comes to a newspaper article that's about a car accident that kept him from playing football anymore. But he's interrupted when Audrey knocks on the door. When he answers, She tells him that she's come to a decision, but she has a question first. She asks him if he's been with another woman since they started having problems. When David tells her no, she breaks down in tears and apologizes over and over. She tells him that she wants to start again as a second chance. Aw, that's a wholesome moment. If I know anything about comic book heroes, it's that this won't last long though. This is his taste of happiness before getting plunged into a wayward world. Speaking of, Elijah shows up at his work the next day. Fantastic. Elijah finds it interesting that David chose to work in security, and as they walk down the line, David gets a sense that someone was carrying a weapon, and Elijah's amazed to see that David's senses can tell him that. He tries to convince David that he has powers again, but David has had enough of that conversation. When Elijah leaves the stadium, he chases after the man that David thought was carrying a weapon, and he ends up falling down the stairs to the subway. Elijah ends up breaking his bones on the way down, but he spots the exact weapon that David described tucked away in the man's pants. When David gets home from work, he and Joseph go inside to work out, and Joseph ends up testing how much David can bench press by putting way too much weight on the bar. This boy could have killed his dad, and he just wants to keep putting on more? There's no way that Joseph could spot David with this weight. If David ended up dropping that on himself, that's it. Done. Joseph and Audrey couldn't even take it off of him. But David and Joseph just keep adding more and more weight. He ends up doing 350 pounds. It's crazy. Meanwhile, Elijah gets checked out by the doctor, and it turns out that he's had 14 breaks. After some time, Audrey goes to work, and it turns out that Elijah is her new patient at physical therapy. Elijah tries to ask her as many questions as possible, but when he mentions David by name, Audrey gets a little more intrigued by her new patient. At work, David tries to test his senses with the surrounding crowd, and he actually gets glimpses of the evil people have done. When he decides to test his theory, he finds out that his instincts are just a little off, but he gets interrupted when he finds out that Joseph got hurt at school. David heads to the school to hear about Joseph's incident, and the school nurse reminds him of a horrible accident that David actually went through at the school pool when he was a child. This woman has the best memory ever. David's accident at the pool is a literal urban legend to all of these kids, and he doesn't remember any of it. Meanwhile, ancient school nurse recognizes David immediately. Anyways, it turns out that he basically died when he was a kid at the school. He's definitely got enough accidents from his younger years to credit an origin story. That evening, Audrey tells David about Elijah becoming one of her patients, and she tells him that she doesn't really believe what Elijah said. Joseph does though, and he comes into the kitchen with David's gun fully loaded. He points the gun at David and swears that he won't get hurt, but David and Audrey try to talk him out of pulling the trigger. It's only after David threatens to leave him that Joseph decides to put the gun down. The next day, David goes to visit Elijah, and Elijah tells him that he confirmed his suspicion of the man having a gun the day he broke his bones. Elijah thinks that David faked his injuries in the car accident so that he could be with Audrey instead of being the football star. But David tells him about his accident that happened when he was a kid by the pool. Elijah makes a point though. He never said that David couldn't be killed. He only said that he couldn't be hurt. That evening, Elijah goes to the comic book store, and he causes a stir when the owner tries to wheel him out of the store. Meanwhile, David and Audrey go on their second first date, and they try to be honest about their feelings for one another. The more they press, the more they realize that David's been actively pushing away, and Audrey tries to bring him back to her. When they get home, the babysitter tells David that a security job in New York called about offering him the job, and she says that the other call that came through went to the answering machine. Remember answering machines? How many of you have no idea what I'm talking about? I bet some of you don't even have a landline anymore. After the babysitter leaves, Audrey tries to tell David that she won't resent him if he wants to take the job in New York, and she congratulates him before going to bed. David heads out to the answering machine, and he hears that Elijah's the one that called. Elijah points out that he realizes that he's the opposing force to David, and he knows David's weakness is water. David decides to go to the warehouse that holds the remains of the train accident he was in, and he finds the exact seat he was sitting in. A memory of the car accident pops into his head, and we see that he wasn't actually harmed in the accident. He went back to the car to save Audrey from the burning vehicle, and he actually ripped the car door off to get to her. David calls Elijah and tells him that he was right about the car accident, and Elijah tells him to go where people are. David heads to the train station, and as the people bump into him, he gets glimpses of the bad deeds they do. He senses one woman that stole from a jewelry store, a man that committed a hate crime, a man that raped a woman that was intoxicated, and another man that murdered a man. David follows the murderer to the victim's house in the middle of the night, and he finds the body. David looks around the house for the murderer, and he finds the victim's children tied up in the bathroom. David unties them both, and he heads to the master bedroom where he finds the wife tied up as well. He looks around for the culprit, but the man pushes David over the edge of the balcony. David's surrounded by water, and he starts to panic a bit as he looks around to find that he landed on a tarp that covered the pool. That's a huge phobia of mine. Being trapped in the water is an absolute nightmare. It sucks that David's first hero mission literally had him fall into a huge pool. It's the worst luck possible. The children he freed help him out of the pool, and David heads back inside to take the murderer down. He ends up putting the man to sleep, and he rescues the wife who's tied up to the radiator. After he unties her, she slumps to the floor, and David heads home. Once home, he hangs up his security poncho, and he carries Audrey to their bed upstairs. In the morning, Joseph goes to the kitchen to find his parents happily together at the table. Joseph is rather confused about what's going on, but he sits at the table to enjoy Audrey's cooking. Audrey tells the others that if Elijah shows up again, they should call the police, and David and Joseph quietly agree. David quietly pushes the newspaper to Joseph to show him the headline. When Joseph reads about a hero that saved 2 children the night before, he knows exactly who it's about. Poor Joseph. He's probably wishing that he had just shot David earlier to prove everything. I'm still curious as to whether or not that would have actually hurt him. I guess we'll never know. Later on, David goes to Elijah's art gallery opening, and he ends up having a conversation with Elijah's mother. David confirms that he's becoming friends with her son, and she tells him that she's very proud of where Elijah has brought himself. She heads over to Elijah to tell him that David's arrived, and the two of them head to the back of Elijah's office. Once there, he shows David the headline on the newspaper, and he asks if David woke up with the same sadness that he's had for years. David tells him that the sadness is gone, and Elijah thinks that this is where the two of them shake hands. When David touches Elijah, he gets a sense of the fact that Elijah's the mastermind behind the huge accidents. He was doing it to test the theory of superheroes existing. He's the one that caused the train accident. David looks around and realizes that the office is covered with headlines of disasters Elijah's caused. And he realizes that Elijah was actually the villain the whole time. I definitely didn't see that coming. Elijah has killed hundreds, possibly thousands in the attempt to find his superhero. In the end, David snitched on Elijah, and they found 3 acts of terrorism. There's definitely a lot more than that. Of course, Elijah's in a facility for the criminally insane, and we finally have our official villain, Mr. Glass. Then, the credits roll. Maybe we'll check out the sequel to this soon. Split is a performance that one isn't soon to forget. Give it a shot. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more like this one. Comment what you think I should watch next, and I'll see you in the next video.